Welcome to this episode of the Complete Curiosity Podcast. I'm Ralph Behnke and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Alan Watkins. Today we're focusing on every scientist's obsession, measuring what matters. In this episode, we'll discuss the two methods organizations use to assess the quality of their talent pool and why choosing the right approach holds the key to understanding human potential and leadership success. We'll also be distinguishing vertical and horizontal development. We'll discuss the 8 lines of development that matter in every organization. We'll zoom into one of the most important and complex topics discussed in leadership circles, emotional intelligence. We'll unravel the complexity of measuring emotional intelligence and why it's essential to consider all 12 dimensions of this critical capability. Our goal is to stimulate your curiosity, help you measure what matters and what moves the dial for you. Feel free to email us on this topic, otherwise buckle up, get your slide rule out and be ready to put measurement under the microscope as we get forensic and scientific in this episode of Measure What Matters. Hi Alan.
Hi Ralph, how's things?
Very sticky. It's very hot where I am.
Yes, well,
looks a lot cooler where you are.
It is. We're north of the jet stream, and of course you're in the Ibiza, which is, what is it, 35, 40 degrees? Where are you?
It's the humidity. It's north of 80%, and my eyeballs are sweating. We've got something very interesting to talk about today. Measuring what matters. And I think we'd like to break down some concepts here. So if I might just propose 4 areas to unpack today. So I think the first thing is, vertical versus horizontal development, and then maybe moving into the 8 lines of development that you have a number of assessments for, and really kind of unpacking this idea of developmental versus descriptive assessments. And then we've obviously got, what can we actually measure? And so in the past, you've spoken about lines, levels, states, quadrants, and types. So let's start with this concept of vertical versus horizontal development. What do we actually mean by either of those?
Yes, the Centre for Creative Leadership in the States have suggested that vertical development's the #1 leadership issue over the next 10 years. And it really comes to the idea that when you're trying to predict the success of anybody, it's less about what they know and more about how they use what they know. It helps us with the distinction between learning and development. So learning, as we see it, is the acquisition of skills, knowledge, and experience. And development is really you become more sophisticated. So you can acquire knowledge, you can have an experience, but it doesn't mean you're any more sophisticated. You're more knowledgeable, but you're not necessarily more sophisticated in your living the knowledge, if you will. So it's knowledge into wisdom. And so various academics around the world have sort of coined this phrase, vertical development. And the whole notion really started with child development and Piaget in the 60s. So up until Piaget started writing and helped us understand that children go through very predictable levels of sophistication. Physical. They learn to stand up. They learn to walk. And cognitive. They learn to conceptualize in increasingly sophisticated ways. So up until Piaget and the various developmental theorists, we didn't really understand development as a phenomena. But more recently, people have realized that this doesn't just apply to children, it applies to adults. So adults, just like children, go through specific stages of increasing sophistication. So they've all been pretty well mapped now, but the assessment industry hasn't really caught up with that. So a lot of the assessment industry doesn't measure sophistication, it measures other things, which we'll get into. But the game changer that most organizations seek is unlocked through increasing sophistication. So a metaphor I'll often use is leveling up in gaming sense. If you're playing an online game, every time you break through from level 17 to level 18, you experience new phenomena at the new level, and usually you get more assets, skills, and capabilities. And that's how it is with human and adult development. So if we develop vertically, every time we move up a level, we often get faster, more skillful, more sophisticated, able to handle more complexity. And for that reason, that's why it's really helpful in a leadership context, because as the world speeds up and things become more complex, the only way as leaders we can cope with that is we ourselves develop to keep pace with the increasing complexity of the world. So we need to become more sophisticated, more nuanced, able to handle more complexity, faster in our thinking. So that's vertical development. So it's not about more knowledge, in terms of a volume effect. It's better able to use the knowledge we've got and opening up to new ways of deploying that knowledge.
I really like the idea of knowledge into wisdom. And maybe that's the key thing that's going to separate us from AI. At the end of the day, all the knowledge is available. But obviously, it's the wisdom, it's the application of that knowledge that's going to be key. So let's just think about, how people might understand that. It's very easy to understand horizontal development. So it's easy to understand how I can add more information, but it's a little bit less easy to understand, what the components of vertical development are. If I go onto Coursera, I can see lots of courses in all kinds of things, but I don't really see anything there that sets out, this is how you vertically develop yourself. So let's just talk about those 8 lines and what some of those components of vertical development are.
Yes, and so it's more about not what you know, but how you know it. How you make sense of the stuff that you've got. And again, this started with Howard Gardner and the idea of multiple intelligences. So it used to be thought that, at school, we basically train people's, verbal intelligence and their mathematical intelligence. So maths and English, essentially. And then, the academic community started to realize that there were lots of kids who were super smart, but just not very good at maths and English. So they were smart in a different way. And so Howard Gardner did a lot of the original research and sort of characterized 7 other sort of types of intelligence. So he described kinesthetic intelligence, for example. People are very good at sports, or, ballet or, they've got a sort of ability to move in a sophisticated way. So their joint position sense is good, their balance is good, their muscle strength is good. Or you might see, alternatively, people who are very good at music. They're not very good at maths or English, but they're brilliant musicians. They just have a natural gift. So, of course, people who've got perfect pitch, like Elton John, naturally gifted at stuff. So this idea was born that there are other types of intelligence. So we can think of these lines of development as different sorts of intelligence, if you will. Visuospatial intelligence, for example. So one of the things in the IQ testing is it was very biased towards a sort of Western version of intelligence. So in the sort of visuospatial part of the IQ test, a lot of it was very angular. Whereas if you grew up in Africa, and you're much more familiar with nature and you don't see angles because you haven't grown up in a city, the IQ test was biased against you. So you would score lower IQ, not because you had a lower IQ, but because the test was biased in favor of people who'd grown up in an urban environment and had seen corners and shapes and angles and were used to manipulating in their mind corners and shapes and angles. So visuospatial intelligence, musical intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, verbal intelligence, mathematical intelligence. So there's these multiple intelligences which now are more thought of as multiple lines of development, if you will. And of course, there are hundreds and hundreds of these things. So, for example, you could develop your cooking intelligence. So my mate Heston Blumenthal would be pretty, high on that level of intelligence. Me, I'd be pretty much a 0 because I kind of burn water. I'm terrible at cooking. But I don't run a restaurant, so it doesn't really affect my life too much. So in most companies, we think that there are 8 intelligences or 8 lines of development that matter most of the time for most companies. I mean, there are many others, but we think these 8 matter in pretty much every company on the planet.
So we're going to jump into these 8 and just describe them a little bit more, and obviously understand how we can actually measure what matters. One of the concepts that you talk about is this difference between developmental versus descriptive assessments. Obviously, assessments are primarily the tool that we use to measure what matters. And I think one of your criticisms, if you like, of some of the existing tools is they've been developed, back in the 50s or even before then. So they're not really even fit for a modern age. But probably the biggest thing is that they are kind of based on typology and they're descriptive in nature. And you're proposing something that focuses more on the developmental aspect. So how should we understand the difference between those two?
Well, we first of all got to understand the difference between descriptive and developmental. And this is unbelievably important because, we've been saying for 20 years to organizations is as fascinating as the information generated by these descriptive assessments is, they can't predict the future, and they were never designed to predict the future. So you're using these assessments in a way they were never really designed for. And there are basically 3 sorts of descriptions. You can have a description of your personality. So things like the Hogan, which is probably one of the most widely used instruments to assess the big 5 dimensions of personality, conscientiousness and agreeableness and introversion and so on. So people can measure personality. If you read the leadership literature, there isn't one personality that always succeeds. So why do we keep measuring personality? Because it's non-predictive of success. But I mean, it's fascinating to see, you're this level of conscientious and you're this level of introversion or extroversion and so on. But it's not predictive. So you can't use it to predict, who's going to succeed when promoted. But organizations keep measuring this stuff. So if you don't use personality tests, you use strength finders, like Gallup or Buckingham Strength Finder, for example. And the whole philosophy there is these instruments, pick almost randomly 6 strengths and trying to make a case for the 6 that they're privileging are the important ones, and actually you're strong at this and you're not so strong at that and da-da-da-da. But again, read the literature. There aren't one set of strengths that always succeed. I mean, if there were, we could just do a cookie-cutter leadership. We can say this personality and this 6 strengths, promote those people who have got that personality and those 6 strengths, and they'll always win. It's not the case. Or the third sort of thing is typology, and the most widely used typology in the world is Myers-Briggs. Very poorly researched, 16 types of leaders. You're an INTJ or an ENFP, but lots of different types of leaders succeed. So it doesn't really matter whether you're an INTJ or an ENFP in terms of predicting whether you're going to succeed in this new role. So, but the assessment industry, and it's a multi-billion-pound industry globally, has been measuring these things for years and years, and is still advocating variations of typologies, enneagrams, bell bins, all these kind of typologies. And there are thousands of typologies. It's interesting. What is your spirit animal? What type of spirit animal do you identify? Well, I mean, this is fascinating conversations, of course, but it doesn't really predict. Whereas what we think organizations should be doing is developmental assessment, not descriptive assessment. So I'll see if I can make that clear. A metaphor for developmental assessment, of course, is age. It's a bit of a blunt metaphor, but it will serve our purposes. So imagine your company is being run by 6-year-olds. And ironically, there are some companies who are run by people you might imagine are not far north of being 6-year-olds. Anyway, imagine your company being run by 6-year-olds. It doesn't really matter whether they're agreeable 6-year-olds or disagreeable 6-year-olds or conscientious 6-year-olds or not very or introverted 6-year-olds or extroverted. The reason they fail to run your company successfully is because they're 6. And this company really needs a 12-year-old or an 18-year-old, i.e. they're failing because of a lack of sophistication, not because of a personality or a certain type of leadership or a certain set of skills. that's not why they're failing. They're failing because they're just not sufficiently sophisticated for the job. So to measure sophistication, you have to measure the level of development across these 8 lines or 8 intelligences. So how sophisticated is this person? And is that sophistication sufficient to succeed in this role? So that's what we encourage organizations to do, is to get into these 8 lines of development and start to measure those. And that's what we do with all of our clients.
And do you think this is something that organizations are experiencing? Are they understanding that there is a defect, if you like, in terms of the information that they're receiving from these descriptive assessments?
Well, they're beginning to. They're beginning to wake up. So the smart ones have already started to clock this. So ourselves and other organizations around the world have been sort of putting this message out for some time. And even one of the big 5 consultancies, I was in Australia at their request last year, where we were teaching the next generation of leaders in Australia. And we measured their level of sophistication in terms of their ego development. We'll come to that in a minute. So organizations are beginning to wake up. The smart ones are beginning to realize that developmental assessment is much better at predicting the future than descriptive assessment. So it's starting to happen, but it can't happen fast enough in my view. But people tend to buy what they're familiar with, even though it's not working very well, and then try and make the case for it. So, but given the world's moving very quickly, we're strong advocates of what makes a really good assessment of leadership is it's developmental, point 1. Point 2 is it's built on some proper research, so evidenced, as we would say. What's the scientific evidence that this particular phenomena in terms of this line of development helps? The line of development has to be meaningful. That goes to my cooking example. If you don't run a restaurant or a suite of restaurants, measuring how sophisticated you are in your cooking line of development is meaningless. And if you've got a good assessment of these lines of development, they should be able to be measured independently of each other. So, for example, you'll see, and we'll get into the detail of this, when you're measuring something like emotional intelligence, your assessment of emotional intelligence should be clean and not contaminated with a whole bunch of other things. So what makes a good developmental assessment is it's, number 1, developmental. Number 2, it's based on some proper research. Number 3, it's relevant to your company. And number 4, it's measuring a pure phenomena, not some amalgam or some blurred concept.
So let's just dip into those 8 lines then. You've mentioned 2 there already: emotional, ego maturity. What are some of the others?
Well, there's 5 you can't see. So when you look at a leader, you can't see. So there's 5 what we call inner lines of development. And so the first one is literally physical energy. So that's really about the amount of energy you've got and the quality of the energy. And we measure this. The best way of assessing this is back to my days as a cardiologist by measuring something called heart rate variability. So there's about 40,000 papers in the scientific literature looking at the quantification of heart rate variability to give you some indication of, is this leader running on fumes? Are they failing to deliver or failing to perform simply because they're knackered? They're so exhausted, they've got nothing left in the tank. And it's nothing to do with, cognition or emotional intelligence. They're just tired. They're just worn out. Or is this leader running with a full tank? So you can quantify energy levels in terms of how much energy they've got, and is it high quality energy or is it sort of chaotic energy? So we measure that, and it's quite interesting. So we've been measuring heart rate variability in leaders for over 20 years. And it's amazing, Ralph, what you can tell about how well or poorly a leader leads just by looking at their biology. So that's the sort of first inner line of development. And then you've got these 2 of emotional intelligence and cognitive sophistication. And actually, even though historically industry's been absolutely fascinated with cognition and, assessing aspects of cognition, reasoning capability, for example, is something, learning styles is something that, well, in our experience over the last 20 years, most people who are leading others are smart enough. It's very unusual to find somebody failing because they're just too dim-witted. So we very rarely, ironically, even though it's a critical line of development, we very rarely measure it. What we often measure is emotional intelligence. Most of the leaders in front of us are smart enough, so measuring cognition doesn't really differentiate those that will succeed from those that fail. But emotional intelligence is really key. And it certainly does hold people back. And we can dig into the details because it's pretty fascinating, emotional intelligence, about the 12 levels of emotional intelligence. So physical energy, emotional intelligence, cognitive sophistication, values. There are 8 different value systems on the planet that it's possible to quantify. And then ego maturity. So they're the 5 lines of development that you cannot see. So let's imagine you've got maximum altitude on all of those, i.e. you're the most sophisticated it's possible for any human being to be across all 5 of those lines of development. It will count for nothing if it doesn't translate to your behavior. So the 3 external lines, which you can visibly see, our behavior. So let's imagine on the inside you're the Dalai Lama, but it doesn't translate to your behavior. So we measure behavior and we can get into that, behavioral sophistication, not just present absent, but to what degree is any particular behavior present. So there's behavioral sophistication. So let's imagine that you're the most sophisticated level of behavioral manifestation, as it were, but you live in a cave. So networks, you've got to be well networked, and the sophistication of your networks is something that we assess. And after networks, it's then the impact in those networks. So those are the 8 lines: physical, emotional, cognitive, values, ego, all the interior lines, behavior, networks, and impact. Those are the 8 lines of development we believe matter in every company on the planet.
So if we kind of think of this as a hierarchy, we kind of identify these 8 lines, but then of course each one of these in themselves breaks down into further concepts and levels. So let's just kind of take a look at emotional intelligence. How do you actually go about measuring emotional intelligence?
Well, this has been fascinating to me pretty much my whole life. And I remember keynoting at a conference the very first time Daniel Goleman, who popularized the concept of emotional intelligence with his book, when he first came to the UK more than 20 years ago, I keynoted on the same conference with Daniel. So I've been very interested in this right from the sort of get-go. And it's become common parlance now in most organizations, the whole notion. And the sort of sound bite is IQ gets you hired, but EQ gets you promoted. And that's a sort of very rough guide. I.e. your success is more down to your emotional intelligence than your cognitive sophistication, which is true. So over the years, we've recently done a bit of research where we've looked at more than 200 questionnaires that are out there in the marketplace that purport to measure emotional intelligence. More than 200 questionnaires, Ralph. And in those 200 questionnaires, we looked at more than 2,500 individual questions that were looking at some aspect of emotional intelligence. So we read through more than 650 research papers covering more than 800 concepts that were purporting. And what we discovered was something pretty interesting, is that if you look at the top 8 assessments of claiming to measure emotional intelligence, as we did, just look at the top 8, what we discovered is that most of them only measured part of the phenomena of emotional intelligence. Either a third of the whole terrain or about half. The best ones only measured what we would consider half of the ideas that were truly important for emotional intelligence. So we've sort of defined these 12 levels of emotional intelligence, and most of the current assessments out there, which are widely used, at best measure 6 of these 12 dimensions. So happy to run you through those 12 dimensions. And just to explain, when you're trying to measure emotional intelligence, you really need to get a grip of all of these 12 and tease these 12 dimensions apart, because they're not the same thing. So, for example, I'll just jump in the middle of it. Your ability to accurately label what you're feeling, which is called your emotional literacy, is a very different capability than your ability to regulate your emotions. It's not the same thing. So if the test has those two phenomena blurred together, then it's not going to get precision, because whether you're able to label your emotion or whether you're able to control your emotion, they're two completely different phenomena. So your assessment has to tease apart those two things, because if you're going to improve somebody's emotional intelligence, are you trying to improve their literacy or are you trying to improve their self-regulation? So it's really key that we tease apart these 12 areas so we can measure each one of these 12 areas precisely, so we can give people appropriate guidance of, well, which bit are you strong at and which bit are you not so strong at? So which bit do you really need to practice, if that makes sense?
Well, and of course, just looking at Complete App, where you've actually set out you've set out all 12 of these assessments of emotional intelligence. It breaks down even further because you've got something like 37 subscales there.
Correct.
So I think what I'm appreciating is that you can get really forensic and quite specific with this. So how would organizations really use this? So, understanding somebody's emotional literacy or their ability to regulate emotions, how would you see that manifesting in an organization or a team?
Well, I think it's really important because you often deal with the HR community, and the organization doesn't necessarily need to know all the forensic kind of complexity of this. But what they do need to better do is to inbound somebody that does understand all of this. It's like I often think of, as we move forward and companies shrink in size and AI takes over various jobs, one of the things that organizations need to be good at is quarterbacking, as I call it. So in the L&D space, does the person who runs L&D for the organization, can they quarterback in all of this brilliance from outside of them? They don't need to be brilliant at it themselves, but they need to be able to identify people who really know this stuff and quarterback them in. Just in the same way as if you're running, marketing departments, is you need to be able to identify who are really good at social media platforms, who are good at campaigning, who are good at sales funneling, and quarterback, I play these capabilities into your system. And the same is true in this field, is organizations need to be able to partner up with organizations like ourselves who really understand this in detail, and then we can solve the problem for them. So there are, because as you said, 37 different subsets, and so you wouldn't necessarily measure all of these straight out the gate, but you can gradually pick up data. So if you want to improve the emotional intelligence of your leadership pool, starting to get a handle on, well, which bit is our leadership pool good at and which bit are they not so good at? So, for example, in the 12 dimensions, they break down to things that might be to do with your energy, stuff that might be to do with your emotion, and stuff that might be to do with your social interaction. So if we start with the energy, so level 1 and level 2, are you even aware of your energy? And we've got some very interesting data on this, because we'll often, as you know, track leaders' biology for 1 to 3 days, when they're at work, just track their biology and then ask them questions about, well, how did you feel? And many leaders, they're so focused on their email and their spreadsheets and their tasks and their targets and their metrics, they're relatively poor at quantifying whether they're running on fumes or they've got a full tank. So when we actually measure how much energy they've actually got, their ability to identify that themselves is quite poor. So that would be, I'm not really aware of my energy levels. So that's sort of level 1, if you like, of emotional intelligence. It starts with the raw data. How energetic am I or not? And level 2 would be, okay, let's imagine I am quite aware that I'm running on fumes or I've got a full tank. Can I manage my energy levels? So when I've got tired after a few intensive weeks, can I recover that energy or fill my tanks quickly? That's a different capability, right? One is awareness, one is regulation. So that's at the energy level. So that would be sort of level 1 and level 2. And nearly all of the assessments in the marketplace don't touch those two things. They don't touch energy. So if you then move up to level 3, is do leaders understand the concept of emotion? So before we even get to what emotion are you feeling, do you even understand the concept of emotion, or do you think that emotion is some subset of thinking? And that is important, because if you have got this blurred, which is very, very common, that feelings and thinking is just the same sort of stuff, then to be able to become more emotionally intelligent would be very difficult, because you've got it confounded with cognitive processes. And this is very common. I mean, it sort of dogs the mental health debate, where people think there's such a thing called mental health, and their mental health data is bad, and we've got to have, programs for mental health and mental health champions. And of course, the problem with most cases of mental health is they're not mental. The cognition is normal in most cases of stress and anxiety and depression and overwhelm. Cognitive processes are normal. So mental health is really emotional well-being. That's what it really is. But if we blur the idea of cognition with the idea of emotion, and therefore we're not very sophisticated at level 3, then we get these kind of problems we're seeing with the mental health community. So am I even aware of the idea of emotion, and can I distinguish it from other kind of ideas? So that would be a level 3. So let's imagine I understand what emotions are. I know it's not the same thing as thinking. I know why emotions are relevant, because they influence decision making and so on. So then I'm good at level 3. But am I aware of my own emotion? So I might be conceptually aware of the phenomena of emotions, but can I sense my own? That's the level 4 capability. So that's, in its rawest terms, what emotional intelligence is. I'm aware of my emotion. So that would be a level 4. But level 5 would be, what is the precision of that awareness? So the literacy, as I said earlier, is, can I differentiate one emotion from another? That's literacy. That's a level 5 capability. So, for example, we have seen people who are saying, oh, look, I'm really frustrated. Well, is it frustration, or is it annoyed? Or is it angry? And can you actually tell the difference? You say you feel frustrated, but maybe what you're actually feeling is anger. It's not the same thing. And the reason that's important to differentiate is the solution to anger is very different to the solution to frustration. But if you can't make a distinction, you don't know which planet you're really on, then you won't be able to get an effective treatment for anger versus frustration. So that would be emotional literacy. So that's a level 5. And let's imagine you do become more literate, i.e. you start to be able to differentiate multiple emotions. That doesn't mean you can change how you feel. That's a level 6 capability. Can I, if I notice that I'm frustrated, can I move from a state of frustration to a state of joy? And most people can't do that, Ralph, primarily because nobody's ever taught them how to do it. So they just stay frustrated. So that would be emotional regulation. And again, that's very different. The ability to regulate is a different capability than what's now known as resilience. And resilience is the ability to bounce back quickly. So if you've got emotional resilience, that means when you do get knocked over by life or circumstances, it doesn't take you weeks and months to recover. You bounce back in a day or two. That's emotional resilience. That's a level 7 capability. Which is different from a level 8 capability, which is really using any emotion, positive or negative, to drive yourself forward. So self-motivation is different from self-regulation, is different from resilience. So self-motivation is a level 8, which itself is different from level 9, which is what is your sort of natural default state. So do you have a sunny or optimistic outlook as a default? That's very different from can you bounce back. It's very different from can you change an emotion, and it's very different from can you use emotions to drive yourself forward. Do you operate with a sunny disposition? That would be a level 9 capability. So those first 9 are all to do with you as an individual, nothing to do with anybody else. So they're all the personal capabilities, if you like, energetic and emotional. And the last 3 are to do with interpersonal capabilities. So at level 10 is, do I have social empathy? Can I understand your emotion? Now, I can understand mine, but that doesn't mean I can understand yours. So am I empathic? Can I develop rapport quickly with somebody? That would be a level 10 capability. And then a level 11 capability would be, am I aware of my sort of emotional footprint on others? So do I notice my anger is really causing damage, for example? Or do I not notice because I don't even care? So maybe it's even worse. I do notice, I don't care. That's a different thing. But do I even notice? So that would be the social impact that my energy has or my emotion has on others. And then the holy grail of all of this is true social intelligence, where you've got the self-regulation skills in place because you've worked through all these first 9 levels. You've tuned in to the energy or emotional state of another. So that's the level 10. You understand your impact, level 11, and you're able, because you're so socially intelligent, to build a strong and sustainable relationship with a whole range of people, not just the people you naturally resonate with, but even people you don't naturally resonate with. So if you can do that, if you can build sustainable relationships with a diverse set of stakeholders, you're truly socially intelligent. So those are the 12 levels, just very briefly, Ralph. And again, as you said, this is all embedded and it's all measurable.
Yeah, and so we've gone down a route on one of these 8 lines of development. We've focused on emotions. We've gone through the 12 concepts, if you like, that you can actually measure. Now, we've spoken a lot about emotions. One of the areas of feedback that we often get in business, or anecdotally, you hear people talking about, oh, they made an emotional decision. Stop being so emotional. Let's use logic to actually come up with a decision here. So I think a lot of leaders feel there is no space for emotion in business. But what you're describing seems to be completely the opposite.
Exactly. And this is basically a level 3 problem, right? Is I don't understand what emotions are, therefore I'm dismissing them. But as a sort of ex-neuroscientist, there's probably hardly any neuroscientists on the planet left who would argue that cognition exists absent emotion. Even the most hard-bitten neuroscientists would now concede that it's impossible to make a decision without an emotion. There's no such thing as rationality. Rational kind of processes don't work without some emotional overlay. The two are intimately entwined. So I'll work an example for you, Ralph. So when I'm talking to people about this to try and get the point across, imagine you have just a very simple conversation. What do you want for dinner tonight? Somebody, your wife or your other half says to you. Now, if you're anything like me, like most men, your answer to that question is food. Let's have some food. Let's not eat my shoe. Let's have whatever's in the cupboard. I don't really mind. Whatever we've got in the fridge, let's cook that up and let's eat that. So that's the answer. And the reason I can't really make a decision is I don't feel strongly one way or another. But the following evening, the same question emerges. What do you want for dinner this evening? Is you'll make a decision. Curry. You instantly make a decision. Curry. Why? Because you feel like a curry. So the ability to decide quickly is actually driven by emotion. It's not driven by cognition. So if I was to summarize 50 years of academic research on the phenomena of decision-making, you could summarize it thus. All decisions are feelings justified by logic. So if I feel like a curry, I go, right, I'd like a curry. I've made a decision. And then if my other half says, well, why do you want a curry? Here comes the logic. Oh, because we haven't had a curry for ages. Oh, there's a new curry house opened in town. Oh, we get away from the kids. Oh, there's no washing up. There's all the logical justification for what I feel. So if you give you a slightly more commercial example, when we're doing mergers and acquisitions, and you look at the term sheets of 2 companies, should I buy company A or company B? And we do an evaluation and due diligence and all of that. What that really boils down to is you look at the data and you decide. How do you decide? You have a feeling about company A and a feeling about company B. And it's the feeling that causes you to go for company B. And then somebody challenges that. Well, why company B? Now, here comes all the logic. Well, I know company B is a bit more expensive, but I think we've got more value for money. And I think, company A's results have been slightly over-egged and da-da-da. And you deploy all the logic to justify what feels correct to you. So even people listening to this podcast will have a feeling about what I'm saying about feelings driving decision-making. And they'll either feel it's correct or incorrect, right? Oh, he's talking nonsense. We're logical beings. We look at the evidence, we decide based on the evidence. But that itself is a feeling. I have a feeling about the evidence being legitimate or illegitimate, being robust or lacking robustness. And so even how people feel about the statement that feelings drive decision-making kind of proves the point. He's talking nonsense. Yeah, well, why you might feel that, the feeling is proving my point, that you feel I'm talking nonsense. So all decisions are basically driven by feelings, and then logic kicks in. So the idea in business that we must remove feelings, that it's in some way inappropriate, is not only wrong, but it would be impossible. You cannot make a decision unless you have a feeling. And neuroscientists have known about that ever since Phineas Gage, who was the sort of poster child of this entire debate, who was working, a railway man in the sort of 1850s, who sadly had an industrial accident. It was his job to build tunnels, and he used to sort of drill holes in rocks, put some dynamite in those rocks, tamp down some sand around the dynamite so the dynamite didn't just pop out of the hole, light the fuse and explode the rock. And one day he forgot to pour the sand in, and so when he put the tamping iron down the hole, it caught a spark on the rock, which lit the fuse of the dynamite exploded, and this 6-foot steel pole went through Phineas Gage's brain. So it's a very famous case, and what it actually did, Ralph, was disconnect the logic centers, which exist in all of our brains just above our eyebrows, in the prefrontal cortex. It disconnected his logic centers from his emotional centers. Now, he survived the accident, and what they did when they tested his brain function a few months after he'd recovered from that brain injury is his brain worked to make simple decisions like 2 + 2, he would say, was 4. A is to B as C is to, say, D. So simple logic was fine. But if you asked him to make a decision, did you want his next appointment next Tuesday or next Thursday? He couldn't. Do you want to have dinner with your wife or dinner with my wife? He couldn't make any decisions because he didn't have feelings of whether his wife or my wife was better to have dinner with. So the feeling wasn't inputting the logic, so he couldn't make a decision. So that's what originally clued the neuroscience community into the fact that logic and emotions work hand in hand. So to make a decision about acquiring company A or company B, we have to tap into that data set, the emotions and the feelings, which is why we have to have a scientific and technical understanding of emotions and feelings. They're not just warm, fluffy, tree-huggy type ideas. It's the way that our minds work. It's the way that the system works. And all of that understanding feeds into this level 3 capability of emotional and social intelligence. Do we really understand what emotions are? Because the more we do, and the less we dismiss this, then the more emotional intelligent we can become.
Well, I think that's a great argument for kind of leaning into this idea of bringing emotion into business. And I kind of, it's fascinating what you say. All decisions are feelings justified by logic, and of course, logic is kind of coming after the feeling, after the decision has already been made. It's just a way of explaining the world, something that we can't explain otherwise.
No, exactly. And so that's why tuning into, well, what are feelings? And feelings, by the way, are different from emotions. Most people use those two words interchangeably. So if people don't really make the distinction between a thought and a feeling, which is pretty basic, you say, well, okay, now you've understood that thoughts and feelings, they're different things. Feelings and emotions are different things. We've got to distinguish those two things. So an emotion is just energy in motion. Motion, energy in motion. And by energy, I mean biological energy. So the energy that your heart creates, the electrical energy your heart creates when the heart beats, that's electrical energy. So your heart creates electrical energy, but so does your gut. Because when your gut contracts, it creates electrical energy. And this energy is electrical energy or in your muscles. So you can do an EMG in medical terms, the electromyogram, look at the electricity within a muscle, which is what causes it to contract. So all of your bodily systems create electrical, electromagnetic, chemical energy, because the heart creates hormones, the pituitary gland creates hormones, your adrenals create hormones. This is all chemical energy. Your heart creates blood pressure, so that's pressure energy, but so does your gut, with peristalsis, which moves the food through your gut. So your bodily systems create lots of energy, Ralph, like electrical, electromagnetic, chemical, pressure waves, heat waves, sound waves, light waves. All of this energy, if you take all of this composite energy from every single bodily system, that's essentially what an emotion is. It's energy in motion, emotion. That's not the same thing as a feeling. A feeling is the awareness in our mind of the energy. So the energy is always there. Every human being, men, women, anybody, have emotions. Everybody has emotions, but not everybody has feelings. A feeling is the awareness of the energy. So we have to distinguish thinking from feeling. We have to distinguish feeling from emotion and emotion from biology. These are the sort of 4 levels of the human system that you can't see. And so they work in a sort of beautiful, complex interaction. And the more we understand that, the more control we can get over our own system, control over our own energy, control over our own emotions. And that is unbelievably game-changing on our ability to perform. The reason most people underperform is they've got no understanding of any of these types of phenomena, and they certainly don't have any control of these types of phenomena. I mean, most people have barely got much control over their behavior, let alone their emotion. Most people go through life believing their emotions are controlled by others. My boss did it to me. My kids did it to me. My partner did it to me. Somebody's making me feel bad. And the reason people think that is they've got no control of their own emotion. So they're blaming others for how they feel. But we're very keen to encourage people to take radical ownership. Nobody's doing anything to you. The energy that you create in your own system is created by you. So the chemistry of frustration, nobody's injected you with drugs or chemicals to create the chemistry of frustration. You've created that yourself in response to what's going on around you. But if you take ownership of that, Ralph, if you say, I create all of these emotions, good and bad, then I can uncreate them, or I can recreate them, or I can create them differently. So if I take radical ownership, it literally is life-changing when people take ownership because they understand how these things work.
So it feels like we've got a really big blind spot in terms of human development. Schools aren't teaching this stuff. Organizations aren't measuring this stuff. So if you think about kind of putting something in place that really starts to push the developmental agenda, where would you start? You've got these 8 lines of development. You've got the various levels, states, quadrants, and types within each of those 8 lines that you can essentially start to measure. But if you were a leader looking to start to move in a direction of developmental versus descriptive assessment, where would you start? Would you start with all 8? Would you start with emotional?
It's a good question. So often we start with just raw energy, the physical line of development, because it doesn't matter how clever you are, it doesn't matter how emotionally intelligent you are, if you're just knackered, i.e. you're running on fumes, none of the rest of it matters. You don't have any energy available to do anything. So we'll often start with organizations is either individual coaching or team coaching by starting to get a grip of how much energy is in the system and how well are people managing that energy. Now, let's assume we meet a team and in our sort of subjective view, this is a team full of energy, the quant of the energy in the individuals or in the collective is high. So we might not bother measuring energy as the start point. We might get to that subsequently. we might then flip to emotions. And again, make a sort of rough, do we need to formally measure this stuff yet, or will that come later? Now, if we perceive that the emotions are running high and one of the reasons they're underperforming is out of poor emotional regulation, we might start helping them with emotions. But let's imagine that's not the case. There are other things. So part of the skill in working with these 8 lines of development is knowing which one to pay attention to first. And that just comes from 20 years of experience of doing this kind of work. So sometimes you might start with the energy, sometimes you might start with the emotion, sometimes you'll start with the values, because actually there's complex cultural issues that are holding the organizations back. So therefore we might start with the values. Or if the real problem here is you've got some immature individuals in the room and that's what's getting in the way, we might start with the ego maturity. If none of that's the case, but they're struggling to do the right thing, we might look at leadership behaviors. So we might start with any one of these 8 lines, depending on that particular company and what their commercial challenges are. So that's where the skill comes in, is knowing, a bit like training anybody to be good at anything, is being able to see which bit is holding them back first and focus on that. So start with where they're at and fix the big stuff first, the stuff that's holding them back, and then start to move on to some of these other things. Ultimately, if you're really going to develop leaders, you'll end up probably addressing most of these lines of development. But where you start varies depending on the company itself.
I think you've given us a great description of the 8 lines, and I've really got a feeling for this emotional intelligence. And actually, just as you were describing, I can start to understand this idea of vertical versus horizontal development. This isn't the case of adding more information. This is a case of adding more sophistication. And actually, it becomes quite tangible when you start talking about resilience or optimistic outlook or my impact on others. So those are all things that I think we can all collectively understand. They're not really that foreign concepts to us. So really powerful. But I think, Alan, that's really all we've got time for today. I'd love to go into some of those other 8 lines of development to the same level of detail that we've tackled on emotions. I'll share my favorite quote. I'm not quite sure what this says about my state of development, but can we not eat my shoe? I think was my favorite quote of today. But maybe getting a little bit more serious, I think, IQ gets you hired, EQ gets you promoted. I mean, if that's not a concept for everybody to take note of, then I don't know what is.
Well, it's great talking to you. And in terms of eating my shoe, if you watch Charlie Chaplin, he did a whole film where he was so poor, he ate his shoe, which is rather why I like that quote, right? So if you don't know what you're doing, you do end up eating your shoe. But if we can just improve the sophistication across these lines of development, our ability to deliver, to deal better with the world improves dramatically. So I'd encourage people to think about that. Sophistication is often the way out of some of the problems that we face.
Alan, thanks for helping us understand how we can turn knowledge into wisdom. Thank you very much.
Okay, great talking to you, Ralph.